Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone, and welcome to the final Fishtails lecture to present the science of Great Lakes fisheries. Tonight, we have Dr. Karen Murchie, the Director of Freshwater Research at the Shedd Aquarium at the aquarium in Chicago, and she'll present tonight on suckers, swimming superheroes of the Great Lakes. The Fishtails lecture series is an educational program here at Crossroads at Big Creek, and my name is Mark Holy, the program organizer. Tonight is the completion of our 4th year of Fishtails, and I want to express my sincere gratitude for the partnership that has developed between the Crossroads at Big Creek and the Door County Library and myself to present these lectures both in person and via Zoom. And I specifically want to acknowledge Kagan Haringa and Laurel Hauser from Crossroads, and Laura Kayakan and Morgan Mann from the library for their support to make this Fishtails lecture series happen. We'd love to hear your feedback on Fishtails, what you liked about the series, how it can be improved, and any topics that you might have or be interested in future lectures. And so please do contact or drop me a note through email at fishtailslecture@gmail.com, and we would really appreciate that. For those on Zoom, your microphones should be muted during the presentation. Please use the chat feature to ask questions, and we'll address those at the end. This lecture does have live transcription, so to access that, if you want, please click on the closed caption symbol at the bottom of your toolbar, then click show subtitle. And finally, this lecture will be recorded and available on the Door County Library calendar website. And I will say that our first three programs have already been transported or transferred to YouTube, and you can get that link on the calendar date that that presentation was made, and you could watch it again or share it with others. Within the next several weeks here at Crossroads, families will bring their children to observe and or partake in the annual sucker run up Big Creek. Activities will include giving their best sucker face impression as they pose with the fish they just grabbed out of the water. Or others will get fully immersed in chasing the fish up and down the stream. The ecology of suckers in the Great Lakes and its tributaries is less understood than the more popular game fish like trout and salmon. They are even designated as rough fish in the Wisconsin state statutes. Have you ever wondered what the role of suckers play in the Great Lakes fish community? Well, tonight we are very fortunate to have Dr. Murchie to share with us her research on the ecology of suckers in the Great Lakes. Dr. Murchie has a diverse background in fisheries research, having worked in freshwater systems from the Arctic to the Amazon and in marine ecosystems in the Bahamas. She joined the Daniel P. Harther Center for Conservation and Research at the Shedd Aquarium in 2016, and now oversees a staff of research biologists engaged in freshwater biodiversity conservation efforts focused in the Laurentian Great Lakes region. Karen also maintains a research program focused on understanding how environmental change and human activities affect native migratory fishes. Her aim is to undertake a research approach that embraces the complexity of the environment and the human dimension to further understand fisheries, leading to effective conservation and management strategies. Dr. Murchie has published numerous peer-reviewed papers and book chapters, but also really enjoys sharing her research via popular press articles, blogs, TV interviews, and talks like this. Karen received her PhD from Carleton University in Canada, where her dissertation focused on the physiological ecology and behavior of bonefish in tropical tidal flats. Doesn't that sound like a fun project? Her master's degree was obtained from the University of Waterloo, where her research examined young of year yellow perch ecology at the northern fringe of their distribution. Before joining the Shedd, Dr. Murchie was an assistant professor at the College of the Bahamas. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Murchie. it works, actually. I think it's supposed to go the other way. Yeah. Just make sure that's in front of you. Yeah. And then you put that where you want.
Hello.
There we go.
Thank you for joining me. I really am excited to see such an amazing crowd on St. Patrick's Day. I wasn't sure what was going to win out, green beer or suckers. I am short like a leprechaun, so that's something. But I'm really excited about having all of you here. This is the second time I've been able to give a presentation to people in person, and I'm so excited about that. And I also appreciate everybody that has joined in via Zoom or Facebook Live. And Mark, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Coggin, for having me here as well. It's really exciting to share my passion for fish and fish research, and basically could shorten Mark's introduction to me as I am Karen. I love fish, and I like to travel around, and I've lived in different places and have really enjoyed studying them and learning from the people who are tied to the water and love fishing. So I'm excited as well during the question period to hear from some of you and your experiences with suckers, but we'll get on to the presentation here. So celebrating suckers, it is a celebration. It is St. Patrick's Day. And I really do think that if you don't already love suckers, I'm hoping by the end of this that you are sucker fans. They're pretty remarkable species, and I'll share some of the reasons why I feel that way. As Mark introduced, I am the director of freshwater research at Shedd Aquarium, so I do oversee a team of biologists that are focused on a variety of things from amphibian habitat restoration, freshwater mussels, as well as urban ecology. But then I run Shedd's migratory fishes program for the Great Lakes region. And you may or may not know that within the Great Lakes, there's over 50 species that migrate as part of their life history. And we're really interested in these fish because they're quite important to support the $7 billion a year economy that fisheries are in the Great Lakes. And that takes into account the commercial, the tribal, and the recreational fisheries. And I know in terms of this audience, you can have a very good appreciation of that close connection of fish and fisheries to the Great Lakes. It's part of the cultural fabric of this region. So fish migrations are important because they need to get to where they want to go to reproduce, so the populations are sustained. And then there's more than 1.8 million people that come to fish the Great Lakes, and that's a pretty big deal in regions like Door County, where you have a lot of fishing tournaments, and you see the results of people coming to town and supporting the economy. There's a lot of jobs that depend on the Great Lakes fishery, over 75,000 jobs. And then I think too, beyond, you know, enjoying a fish fry and going to restaurants and eating some of the delicious fish, I think right now within the Great Lakes region, and particularly in some urban centers, we're seeing a lot more people relying on fishing as a means of food security. So certainly in a lot of places and in other countries where you've got freshwater sources, fish are a main protein source, but I think, you know, it's something to recognize here in the Great Lakes as well, how important fish are for food security. And then of course too, from sports mascots and festivals celebrating fish, you know, I find a way to put my dog in every presentation. This is my dog Fiji, you know, up north in northern Wisconsin, and you see all around between like fish statues, of course, in Sturgeon Bay, and then just acknowledgements of the importance of the recreational fishery and the commercial fishery to the Great Lakes region. So in terms of some broad threats to migratory fishes, Some of the biggest ones that you can think of are things like barriers to them getting to where they want to go. So if they're leaving the lake proper and heading into rivers and streams to spawn, most of the times when you say barrier, what are big barriers that you think of? Dams, right? Well, dams definitely are a challenge for migratory fishes, but even more numerous throughout the Great Lakes region are culverts. And culverts, when they're working properly, can pass fish. The fish swim under the small roadway where the culvert exists. Small tributaries, you're not going to put a bridge over a creek to pass a car, so the culverts work. But when you've got really strong spring melts, often what happens is you get this real big pulse of water, and over time that can start scouring away the substrate below or downstream of that culvert. And over time that can create a little bit of a waterfall, which maybe if you're a good swimmer like a trout, something like that wouldn't be such a problem to navigate through and jump up and keep going through the culvert upstream to where you want to go. But not all fish are equally good swimmers. So for some of the small body fish, the little minnows, some of the other fish that don't have as deep of a forked tail, that could be a real problem. And when we look at all the different streams around Lake Michigan, only 13% are without a barrier of some sort. So that can be a real challenge in being able to get to where you want to go to access just the right spawning habitat, to have your babies. So that's something to be aware of. So the figure that's up here shows in red where all the dams are, but the blue dots are where all the culverts are. So that's, don't even have to really look too deeply. That's a lot of blue between Canada and the US. And another big threat to fish migrations is what could be happening with shifts in climate. And I'll talk a little bit more about the project that we're doing to understand how climate change could be impacting the timing of fish migrations. So here's the good part. We're getting into the suckers, the stars of this show. There's a number of sucker species, but for this talk, I'm going to focus on the most abundant of the sucker species, the white sucker and long-nosed suckers. These are very common up in the tributaries of Door County, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them. Some things maybe you already know and you're very well versed in sucker ecology, and then maybe I'll do some myth busting also. If you were to take all of the fish by biomass in Wisconsin waters, suckers make up the bulk of that biomass. They are really abundant, and I think a lot of times because they're common, people maybe just don't really think, oh, we have to worry too much about their populations. They're a very important forage species for a lot of the recreationally important fishes. Bass, walleye, northern pike will all eat white and or long-nosed suckers, especially the little baby ones, but it's not uncommon for even some larger suckers to be taken by some big fish like the big northern pike. At one time, and it might even still happen in some locations, suckers were stocked as a food source for a lot of the fish. These guys have cute little mouths at the bottom of their faces. It's really neat when you're looking at a fish, you can learn a little bit more about them just by where is their mouth on their face? Is it at the end of the face? Is it, below their face? Where might they be feeding? So with the mouth on the bottom of the fish, you might infer, well, that is a perfect design for fish that are feeding off the bottom. They're similar to sturgeon in the sense that they eat their food off the bottom. They eat mostly aquatic insect larvae, little tiny crustaceans, and some algae. And we like to call them the wildebeests of the Great Lakes because when you think about mighty migrations, you can think of wildebeests crossing the Serengeti and just, in huge numbers. And in tributaries around Door County too, and some of the larger rivers, like the Kewaunee River and so on just south of here, you can get a quiet tributary or a quiet river, and all of a sudden it turns into a giant party. Depending on the tributary size, you could have hundreds to, thousands, tens of thousands of fish migrating into these tributaries in the spring. So it's sort of analogous to these wildebeest migrations where they're just there in very large numbers. Suckers are iteroparous, meaning that they can spawn more and more times. They don't spawn and die like some of the salmon species do. So what's pretty neat about that is that once they've reached their age of maturity, which is around 3 or 4 years of age, then they can yearly reproduce. If, say, the winter's been good enough and they've had enough food to eat, they can put energy into making their gonads, which is the eggs and the sperm. And so then if they're ready to spawn, they can do that year after year. They do not die after they're spawning. In fact, it's pretty low mortality during spawning. So the fish that you do see that do die, if you're out in Big Creek and you see fish that are dead, they might have reached the end of their lifespan, or maybe they decided, oh, it was maybe not the best winter, but I still want to reproduce. It's a pretty big deal to pass on those genes. So they might have done a real tight balancing act between putting energy towards reproducing and getting upstream, and then maybe that was it for their energy store. And I'll go into a bit more detail about some of the ecological importance of what's happening when they're reproducing in the creeks. They're actually adding a lot of nutrients after a very long winter where there hasn't been any leaves falling into the creek or anything else happening. And I'll explain why that's really important. So we see things like more algae being formed, much bigger aquatic bugs because of the nutrients that the suckers provide. So as Mark alluded to earlier, suckers often, unfortunately, get lumped into this category of rough fish or trash fish. I don't see how any fish species could be considered trash, particularly native fishes that have been here for a long time, functioning and keeping the ecosystem going. But that's something that, unfortunately, with a number of species that are lumped in those categories, they don't often get talked about as frequently. There's maybe not as much research done on them, less education about their importance. So it's really important for us to understand how these other fishes that might not be so popular for recreational angling or maybe less common for people to eat, what role they're playing to support all those other fishes that we do hold at another level. And hopefully soon everybody will feel the same way about suckers and we stop using this archaic terminology of rough fish and trash fish. A myth for some people, like why they might think suckers are a nuisance species. A lot of people feel very passionate about rainbow trout or steelhead, as folks will say, that the suckers might be actively seeking out their eggs to eat them. And that is a myth. So they might incidentally be eating some trout eggs and eggs of other species, but it's minor. They're not actively seeking them out. So that's a myth to be busted as well. And of course, because they are migratory species moving from the main lake basin into tributaries to spawn, you will get some resident suckers in larger rivers. But because they have to move, they've got a number of stressors that can act on them to create more conservation concerns. So that becomes a bit more challenging to manage their populations. And again, because we haven't spent so much time learning about them, there's still many mysteries to be solved. And for this presentation, almost all, I think, of the pictures are ones that I've taken up in Door County or close by. So you can enjoy the beauty of what surrounds you. So I'm going to paint a picture for what is about to happen within a couple of weeks. Spring, hooray. Everybody's ready for this nice warm weather. So this is Big Creek, a picture that I had taken last year. So before the suckers come, you have this nice creek. It's making the beautiful Zen sounds that you can listen to fall asleep. And but there's not much happening when you're looking in the creek itself. You just see water moving, birds chirping around you, all that. Nice, beautiful scene. But then there is a point where the water temperature gets to just the right temperature, and there's enough of a cue from the flow after the snow has melted and we've maybe have had some rain. The water level's up, the creek is moving faster. The fish are like, what is this? This is time to migrate. So what happens is you'll start to get a few individual fish starting to come into a creek. This is some video that I took in Big Creek last year. A few individual suckers poised and pointed upstream, ready to make their way up this small little cascade. So it starts with a few individuals, then you get a few more, and then soon it's an all-out party. This is not from Big Creek, this is Hines Creek in this picture, but you can see how many animals are there, right? That's a lot of individuals, and I'll point out later, we've got a lot of people in the crowd that watch for the sucker migrations in these local creeks, and they can attest to like how it's just like a few individuals at first, and then all of a sudden a few days later, it is like a party, like hundreds of fishes there. And so I had mentioned earlier that in addition to the fish reproducing, and I'll show some really cool, not so X-rated video footage of the fish reproducing in a minute, they are adding nutrients to the creek. So when we think of nutrients and gardening, what are some of the main fertilizer components? Anyone? Any gardeners?
Nitrogen.
Yeah, nitrogen, phosphorus. So these fish are adding those types of nutrients to the creek while they're spawning and excreting, and they're like little gardeners fertilizing the creek at that time. And again, this is right after winter has happened. We've just hit spring. It's like, oh my goodness, a buffet of nutrients all of a sudden, and we're hungry little benthic invertebrates, things like caddisfly larvae that are really delicious food for a trout and other fish species. A really cool study at a University of Wisconsin-Madison had taken a creek that had a big run of suckers. They blocked it up so no fish could get in or out. They measured the amount of nutrients that was coming in, and they found increases in nitrogen and phosphorus. And then they traced those nutrients being picked up specifically by the algae and by the aquatic bugs. And they found that caddisfly larvae were 12% larger in the areas where the suckers were compared to where they weren't. So if you're a trout and you're swimming around and you can eat a much bigger caddisfly larva, that's like upgrading from a cheeseburger at McDonald's to a Big Mac, right? That's an even bigger nutritious meal. What a bonus. So thank you, suckers, for doing that. And again, because they aren't real popular sport fish or anything, we just have neglected to study a lot of aspects of their life history. So here's what it looks like when they're spawning. This is from Hines Creek. So the males have that nice bright red color. The female, there's one right at the front. She's a bit more drab. You'll get what's happening in the bottom of the video here. A couple males, 2 or 3 males, often gathering around the female sucker. They'll start vibrating. The female releases the eggs, and you can actually see some of the eggs being released in the video. And they'll release, the males will release a sperm. See the tiny little white eggs, which is pretty cool to be able to see it. This was pretty remarkable. This was just with a GoPro on a short stick. It was in the water and they were like spawning right in front of me. So that was really neat to see. And yeah, they're just broadcast spawners. So they release the eggs and sperm into the water column, the eggs get fertilized, and then they just fall between the cracks of the rocks. And so that for the fish to be able to get as far upstream, up into a creek as possible is important because they don't build nests, they don't have their eggs sticking to a log or anything. They're just kind of loose in that gravel substrate. So the further they're upstream, if you're thinking of flowing water, you know, some of the eggs are going to get dislodged and washed further downstream. And ideally they want them to stay in the creek or the river because that's like the right conditions for the eggs to develop. There's more things to eat their babies out in the lake and so on. So that's why some of the barriers to migration could be a problem in terms of them accessing good quality habitat, but also meaning that, you know, they don't have to trade off like, well, we can't get where we want to go. I guess this is a good spot and spawn closer to the mouth. That could end up with their eggs getting covered over by sediment and not having good survival. So as I mentioned, we don't know so much about suckers. So this is the opportunity for us to start thinking about ways of filling in some of those gaps about their biology. So we've got a number of ways that we're approaching this, from having volunteers or citizen scientists documenting the timing of the fish migrations. Why that is important is because if we've got shifts in climate, and we've talked about how the fish are tuned in to water temperature cues because they're ectotherms, their body temperature relies on the temperature of the water. So when it's a certain temperature, they're like, okay, it's time to move. If you have spring starting to happen earlier than normal, we start reaching higher water temperatures, the suckers might be like, oh, okay, it's time to spawn. They go show up in the tributaries, reproduce, add all those nutrients. But if there's a mismatch in when they show up to when the aquatic insects might be ready to take up those nutrients, that could have some negative impacts that we're just not sure what that would look like. So we've got these volunteers documenting year after year, when did they see the suckers show up to the different creeks, and we're trying to match up, you know, what exact water temperature cue or water velocity it is that they're looking for. We're also trying to understand, does the same sucker come back to the same creek year after year to spawn? So we're doing some pretty basic tagging to be able to address some of those questions. Using things like video footage that you had seen previously to understand some more about their dynamics. Is it always 2 or 3 males around 1 female? How long does the spawning activity last? Is there a difference between long-nosed suckers and white suckers? So videos work simply to gather that information. We're using some new technologies. Last year, I worked with a researcher out of Cornell University, Dr. Aaron Rice. He loaned me some equipment to put a microphone underwater for me to record the sucker spawning sounds. So that's another neat technology that could be applied in areas where there's low visibility in a creek or a river, and you could simply just listen for if the suckers are here or not. And all this types of information isn't just collected and sat on. The opportunity exists then to provide that information to resource managers to say, hey, the same suckers show up to the same creek year after year to spawn. Or, hey, you've got a culvert that's not passable and the fish want to be able to get upstream to access good spawning habitat. And then there's an opportunity to work to replace the culvert to give them the access again to get upstream. So this is all what we're doing here, and I'm going to highlight a few of the projects and explain some of the findings over the past few years and give you a sneak peek of some of the work to come. So to document whether or not climate change might be having an effect on the timing of sucker migrations, we want to have a good latitudinal spread of sites for people to monitor. So from Highland Park, Illinois area up through South Milwaukee, Manitowoc, 2 rivers, and through Door County, we have a number of sites that people monitor. And we additionally have some sites on the south shore of Lake Superior. A couple of the sites towards Bayfield and Ashland, Wisconsin, I have Sunset because those tributaries look like chocolate milk most of the spring. They have a lot of red clay up there. It's very hard to see in the tributaries. So it wasn't working out so well for people to do the regular citizen science program, which just involves people literally peeking in a creek and going, are the suckers there yet? So the tributaries really range from tiny ravine creeks, which is in the, I guess that'd be your top left. That's one of the ravine creeks in Highland Park. That was in an area where they had recently restored a culvert that was impassable and started to see fish come back. So we've got small ravine creeks to very large urban rivers like the Menominee River, the Kinnickinnick River in Milwaukee, very big, very urban, to beautiful creeks like Hines Creek, which is on Door County Land Trust property, and a gradient in between. So I've got a number of the citizen scientists or volunteers in this room. I would love to take a moment to acknowledge you guys. For everybody that's a volunteer, if you could wave or if you feel comfortable standing up, you can look around the room. There's a lot of great monitors here. And yes, thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. So this is the 6th year that I've been running the program for volunteers to participate in monitoring a tributary by where people either live or work or spend a lot of time at. And it is a real labor of love. We set up the monitoring stations as soon as the creeks are open, and not long after that, people start going out every day. Are the suckers there yet? No. And so this is what a monitoring station looks like. It's just there's a piece of rebar that has a staff gauge, which is just a big ruler. And then there's a half cinder block with a data logger attached to it that measures water temperature as well as depth. And it takes those readings every 15 minutes. So we can look at, is there a water temperature cue? Depth is a proxy for flow. If the depth goes up and down, we can tell whether or not the flow is changing. And then the volunteers with their data sheet, write down the date, the time of day, and then some things like weather. Is it a rainy day? Is it a cloudy day? Things that might impact how easy it is to see suckers if they're there, right? And then if there had been a rain, maybe the water clarity isn't so good. So we're trying to get a handle on whether or not it's clear or cloudy or turbid. And then simply, do you see suckers, yes or no? And if you do, how many? And so this is what volunteers note. Sometimes the monitoring goes on for more than 60 days. I'm seeing the nods, especially for some of my volunteers that are for Fish Creek and Rebull. Every year we're like, oh, we better still start early enough just in case. What if this is the year that they show up earlier? We don't want to miss that first appearance. So this is a real time commitment from these volunteers, and I appreciate it so much. So this is footage by our very own Joe Taylor, who's here in the audience, because you might say, well, how easy is it to see suckers if they're in the creek? I don't know. This, you can see with the drone footage, every single wiggly body in the image here is a sucker, and it's pretty easy to count. Yes, this is a bird's eye view with a drone, but most often, even just standing on the shore, you still are high enough elevation to have a pretty good view of what's happening. And there's a number of locations that people are able to stand on a bridge, like over the Menominee River in Milwaukee. Great bird's eye view to take a look at what's happening. So this is really cool. And in all honesty, there are a number of different research programs for fisheries, more in the marine environment, that are starting to utilize drones as a way of like looking for sea turtles or for other animals. So this is a pretty neat way of looking at the sucker footage. So that's the citizen science program. And again, that's really trying to understand, what's driving the fish to migrate in, and could climate change be having an impact? Then I mentioned we're really curious, do the same fish come back to the same location year after year to spawn? Well, one way of starting to address that is to use a pretty inexpensive technology called pit tags, which are passive integrative transponders. How many people have a dog or a cat at home that is microchipped? Okay, a good number of people. The same technology for microchipping your pets we can use for fish. And it's really great because these are inexpensive tags. They're only around $3 a piece, depending on the size. Sure, the vet charges more when you can get your animal microchipped. But what's really cool about these tags is there's no battery that dies when there's a wand that is scanned over a lost dog. It activates a little electromagnetic switch. The reader goes off and it gives the tag's unique ID, and then you can match that lost dog to its owner. Well, similarly, we can implant fish with these tags that all have unique IDs. And when either a little manual wand is scanned over their body, we can find out what fish that was, where it was tagged, what size it was, is it male or female, and we can use that technology. So that's something that's a pretty good way of starting to address those types of questions. So I'll get into the results of these in a second. This beautiful little montage of some of the work that I've mentioned. And again, just a nice opportunity to appreciate how beautiful these fish are and what it looks like when they spawn. This very dramatic footage of me walking into Heinz Creek. And yes, that's what I normally look like in waders, not wearing makeup. And so this, I mentioned, I got to work with a researcher at a Cornell University to listen, like put a microphone in the water. This is, I'm setting up with that microphone to record the spawning sounds. So usually place it out in the creek when I find there's a good spot, and then I'll leave it there and go up on shore to record that information. And then the fish tend to swim right by it, and it's like eavesdropping on them. And of course, a lot of note taking of the observations. This is one of the citizen science monitoring stations. This is the temperature and water depth logger that's attached to that half cinder block. And again, the volunteers are taking recordings every day of the depth, just in case we lose the logger. This is an antenna that is placed in one of the tributaries to be able to pick up the tagged fish as they swim back in. So while I'm asleep, even at night, if the fish are moving by an antenna, it picks that information up and it gets logged into that orange device that you could see. And Door County is beautiful. That's Rebolt Creek. And so I'll give you an example of the things that we found today. So again, with using a citizen science program to document animal migrations, most often that's been done for things like monarch butterflies, the Audubon Christmas bird count, very common in a lot of species, but not so much for fishes. But we're showing with this program that this can work. Very low tech, people with eyes peering in a creek and just looking to see whether the fish are there. And what's great about that as well, there's only one of me, but there's a lot of people that live near tributaries that can utilize their time to document this information. So like I mentioned, this is year 6 coming up here. We've got people that have been doing it this entire time, around 40 participants of various ages, from middle school kids up to, I think my oldest volunteer is 85. I think that's my oldest volunteer. And people too, grad students from University of Milwaukee or University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, participating and so on. So it's really great. And we're documenting lots of fish every year. And again, it is an effective tool. But I think what's more important than, or equally important as collecting the data, if you are walking your dog and you see somebody staring into a creek, you're gonna be curious and say, hey, what are you looking at? And I know every volunteer, I'm sure, can attest to the fact that they've had numerous conversations with strangers talking about, oh, I'm looking for suckers. Why are you looking at suckers? Well, they're really important for the ecosystem. Why? And we've got these ambassadors for the Great Lakes that can share all this information. And there's nothing better than talking to another person to learn that information. And that you never know, they might have an anecdote to share. And my volunteers are so great at writing that information down. So it's a really great opportunity to create real ambassadors for suckers and really for the Great Lakes and the fishery. So I mentioned for that pit tagging program, I thought, okay, I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't wanna tag piles of fish and we never see them again. I'm gonna start in 2017 by putting 100 tags in 100 fish, equally split up between males and females. We'll see what happens in 2018. And I decided in 2018, well, I might as well tag another couple hundred. These tags are not that expensive. So in 2019, of the 300 fish that were swimming around, we had 204 fish out of the 300 come back. And then in 2020, even though that was when COVID hit and I couldn't really be out in the field, I drove up to Door County, put my antenna in the creek, turned around, drove back to Chicago, and data was collecting while I was there. We had 176 out of the 300 fish return. And then last year, 143 out of 300. So there was even some fish last year that were picked up that we didn't see in 2019 or 2020, but were fish that were tagged in 2017, 2018. So they might have skipped a year of spawning, like I mentioned. They can do that. Maybe it was a poor year for energy. I am curious whether or not fish ever do go to another location. Maybe they went to another creek to explore. I'm not sure. And of course, we might have lost some that were preyed upon or died. But this is really showing high spawning site fidelity. So this really gives a reason to say, hey, if there's a culvert that's not functioning well, and we get a good number of suckers coming in here, this is a really important spot to that population. We want to restore it. And then the ecoacoustics, or the sound recordings that I took last year, I am in the midst of analyzing that data, but that's something that I look forward to sharing with you in the future. I mean, you could hear a lot of that underwater sound just from the video footage with the GoPro, but it's kind of neat to be able to see the sound tracings and look to see some of the differences between the species. And then just a highlight of where we're going in 2022 and beyond with the sucker studies. We're continuing with the citizen science program. Jane and Julie in the picture that I took yesterday there in the back of the room here. This is, to look to see if climate change could be impacting the timing of fish migrations. That is a study that needs to carry on for decades. You're all stuck with me forever. So that's something we're continuing. And then this year, I'm super excited to announce we're going to be putting fancy tags. If anyone caught Chuck Kruger's talk in January for Fish Tales, he was talking about the big acoustic telemetry array that researchers around the Great Lakes are using to understand fish movements from walleye to whitefish to lake sturgeon, bass, and so on. We want to know, where do the suckers go outside of the spawning season? Are they moving around all over in Green Bay? Do they stay close to Sturgeon Bay? This is stuff that we're going to be able to start to understand. And this is really thanks to a generous tag donation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Green Bay, and amazing collaborators with University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, Michigan State University, Cornell University, and then support as well from Wisconsin Sea Grant, as well as the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and GLADYS. So I'm super excited. That's a little breadcrumb for, you'll have to come back to another talk once we tag these suckers and we start understanding where they go. And I'm curious whether some of the fish that we see spawning together, how much are they hanging out, year round together? Are they in close association with those same individuals, or do they go their separate ways until spring and then come back together? So, and I'd also like to be able to expand the pit tag program to some of the other areas where they've got permanent antenna arrays out year round in some locations like the Milwaukee River and so on. There's so much more that we can learn on these species. And with that, hopefully I haven't gone over. Just a few take-home messages. Hopefully you are all now suckers for suckers. And they're the most abundant migratory fishes in the Great Lakes. And so we really need to understand more about them and the role that they're playing to support this amazing $7 billion a year fishing industry in the Great Lakes. Again, mentioned their ecological roles from being forage fish for a lot of the species we love to catch, but also adding that buffet of nutrients to the creeks and rivers after a long winter. And by utilizing all these different technologies and volunteers, we start to be able to piece together all sorts of information on these amazing animals. So with that, my email is at the bottom if anyone wants to get in contact with me. And I guess at this point I can take any questions. Thank you all. Do you want this?
Nope.
Oh. Any questions? Hi, Linda.
So one thing that we've been curious about in Fish Creek is that the northern pike always show up in the creek ahead of the suckers. And we're just wondering, do they just have different signals for coming, or is it planned that way? I mean, do the sucker or do the northern pike babies hatch out and then feed on the sucker eggs? I mean, is there something going on between them, I guess is what we're wondering.
Yeah, well, and so these are good observations, and Coggan can probably also say too, in terms of the timing of what fish are showing up in Big Creek too. Do you often see the northern pike in advance?
3 weeks before.
3 weeks before. So it is, and this is sort of that, that natural cycle of things. The phenology is a word that we use a lot for, like, what is that natural rhythm of when animals show up or when the trees start to leaf out. There is really a rhythm, and in terms of that relationship between northern pike and suckers, I'm not sure if, I'm not aware of any like synergy. Mark, do you know of any?
Well, my involvement on that would be some of the work when I was working that we did on the West Shore. And the northerns, when they get large enough, they will feed on the newly hatched sucker fry. And it's a timing that has to be beneficial to northern pike. And actually it helps them stop eating each other. They can eat
Oh, there you go.
right, eat the suckers instead. But they're very voracious. I've seen, a little bitty northern like that with a great big belly and it's real thick, and then it'll have 5 suckers in its mouth. Little bitty sucker fry. So it is an evolved thing, right?
Yeah, and I know when we brought 5th graders down to the creek, they were so excited when they pulled out of the creek a little northern pike that was this big, and they put it under the magnifying glass, and it looked exactly like a big pike.
Oh, absolutely. They're just
Exactly.
teeny tiny
They were
versions.
just like amazed.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark, for that anecdote as well. It's nice to have some other fisheries biologists back up. David.
Well, you mentioned the longnose and the white suckers. What are the other varieties, and are they in the Great Lakes, but they do not come as far north, or?
Yeah, so we do, there are a number of species, and I also had forgot to mention that throughout the Great Lakes, you find the sucker species. They're ubiquitous, they're in all of the location. So You'll also see northern hogsuckers. There's a lot of the red horse species as well, river red horse and so on. So you'll see them. That just more often, the most common is the common white sucker. So that's why that's the one that you most often encounter. And you'll also see more often the long nose too. But these other species move around as well, and they're using rivers to reproduce. So these are just the ones that are easier to highlight. But they're still, for all the sucker species, where we have major gaps. Some of the species we know a little bit more about because their populations have declined a lot of the red horse species. So more information has been gathered on them to try to figure out, like, how do we bring back their populations. But I think an important conservation note too is, just because a species is common, we want to keep them common. We don't want to see their populations decline to a point where it's like, oh shoot, what do we do now to start bringing their populations back? So that's something. I think with the white suckers, even though they seem to be super abundant, there's been some anecdotal information speaking with some folks from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission up in Odena, Wisconsin, saying they've noted that the sucker runs have been less abundant over the years. And I think this is something, that we do need to take note of and start to understand more what's happening. Ooh, I think you had your hand up first. Hi.
Sort of along that line, I don't know anything of much at all about fisheries, but it looks from your presentation that a gravelly stream, fairly swift running, is necessary for them to reproduce. Is that correct?
Yeah, they like the moving water. That's why they're moving into the rivers and creeks to
Okay,
spawn.
so have you noticed degradation due to, and I'm just gonna say, agricultural runoff? And have you seen or been able to measure the effects of agricultural runoff on these tributaries, and what's it doing to sucker reproduction?
Yeah, so I'll say I've only been doing the sucker study since I've come to Shedd, so I still have a lot to learn about these species, to studying them for 5.5 years now. But the Kewanee River, highly agriculture area around there, still gets a very large run of suckers. It can absolutely degrade water quality. A lot of misconceptions as well about sucker species is that they can handle really poor water quality, and they might be able to tolerate the poorer water quality than some of the other species. But if you're a resident animal in that river year round, that might have a bigger impact versus the species that come in and hang out for 2 or 3 weeks to spawn and then leave. But water quality is a big concern, something that we have to think about for any fish species, whether they're in there temporarily for spawning or if they're there year round. What ends up happening more maybe is less about the impact to the quality of the substrate, but it has more to do with the quality of the water and what's the oxygen level like and so on. Increased agriculture runoff can lead to increased algal production, which can take away the oxygen. So there's a lot of complex things that happen. But even in terms of like degraded habitats of losing connectivity because of a development, or if we're talking about other species too, like northern pike that like to access wetland areas and so on, if we fill in some of those areas for development, well, that's not just degrading the habitat, but that we're losing it altogether. And that's an important consideration. Don't spend too much time looking at the water quality aspect. Again, we're seeing, luckily too, and I can even speak on the Chicago River, which doesn't even act like a river because it doesn't go the proper way. But we've seen over time, even just in the last 30 years, with improvements to water quality, better water treatment, better reduce combined sewage overflows, getting a better handle on that type of scenario has allowed the water quality to improve, and we're seeing fish species come back. So there's all sorts of things that we can do to improve the water quality, to make things better for our fishes. Steve, I know you had your hand up.
Yes, are you finding a certain water temperature that activates the suckers from coming into the lake, into the stream?
Yeah, so it's really kind of curious, because you would think, you know, because we've got that sort of south to north gradient, that we would get, you know, the most southern sites being the first places that the suckers come into, and like just pinging its way all the way up. That doesn't happen. So I think there really is this balance of water temperature and flow. But I think what we'll also start to see with the acoustic telemetry is there a cue happening in the lake as well that's starting to drive them closer to the creeks? Because a lot of the times we'll see some of the first suckers show up in the Kewanee River. Mind you, that's a very large system. It warms up faster. There are some resident suckers in there, but that tends to be one of the first tributaries to go. Also in South Milwaukee at Oak Creek, we see the fish show up usually there first, and then Kewanee River not long after. And then even within Door County, there's a lot of variety, not far apart from like Bailey's Harbor to Rebolt Creek. That's not a very far stretch. Rebolt Creek right now is frozen. Hines Creek is flowing because there's other aspects about those tributaries, whether they're spring fed, coming from another lake. So we still have a bit to do to figure out what exactly is that cue.
Yeah, the flow rate didn't seem to make a difference. Last year, we had very little snow, and then when you were there, the flow rate was way down compared to what it has been the previous 4 years. So at least that 1 year, it didn't seem to make a difference as far as flow rate.
Yeah, but I think what's really interesting too, I also observed last year while there, you know, the flow and the water levels were down so much in a lot of these tributaries, I saw suckers staging outside the mouth of these creeks in some cases, and they didn't come in. We didn't see an increase in some of the numbers. So I think what's interesting too with that pit telemetry study is you'll find a few males will come in at 10 p.m. or shortly thereafter. They're like coming up into the creek, you know, has a party started yet? Then they're like, oh, not here. And they go back out into the lake. So it's really interesting. And of course, too, even just from a volunteer perspective, we're going out in the daytime, we're taking a look. We aren't seeing what's happening at night. So there's still some neat things that some of this tagging information reveals of, like, you know, they're coming in, sussing the situation, and then deciding to go back out. And I'm curious, you know, how long that takes place before you see large numbers come in. And that's what we're seeing too in the creek with the tagging, is that they'll do that a few nights in a row, and then you start to see a few more individuals come in. So there's a lot. It also could be a bit dependent on photo period. So like how much daylight, and there's a number of things that we could be missing that we think we're queuing in on the right stuff to answer those questions. But you had a question that'll come up to you.
What's the lifespan of a sucker?
Yeah, so I think if I remember correctly, the oldest white sucker was 22 that was aged. And I think for longnose was not far behind. So they can be pretty long-lived species, and they're reaching sexual maturity around 3 or 4 years of age. So that's quite a lot of number of years for reproducing. Now, mind you, not every individual is going to live to that age, but in terms of the fishes that were aged and some of the oldest documented ones, you know.
And another question, do suckers spawn in lakes, or do, you know, because I've been fishing in lakes that I don't see any stream coming in, but at certain times you'll see the whole bank, you'll see suckers just swimming in mass along the edge. But do they need a flowing water or a river the spawn, or do some actually spawn in the lake?
So you can have still some diversity in the lake fishery strategies where even, like I said, in some of the larger rivers, you'll have suckers year round. So, and you can get spawning too in lakes. So, yeah. You had a question?
My question was the longevity.
Oh, yeah, no, I know, and I think that's pretty remarkable, and again, you know, these are studies where they've taken a large number of suckers and they've aged them and have taken lengths and have looked at a number of factors, but even the amount of studies done there's quite a bit of variety too, in terms of what you might find for the oldest fish in, like, you know, northern Canada versus what you might find in southern Illinois or something. So there's a real range, and I think there's still quite a bit more to be found out about how, you know, what is the average lifespan and so on, because a lot of the times we can age fish often with scales and look at growth rings similar to aging a tree, but for some of the fish species that lose their scales really quickly and they grow back, that's not a great way of aging them. But to get like the best account of a fish's age, often you have to lethally sample them and look at their ear bones or otoliths, which also lay down rings as they grow. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah,
Just one other question.
of course.
Are suckers commercially fished? You know, for like pet food or whatever? I know that I don't eat fish, but a friend of mine has tried them and they're very, very
Oh, sorry. Yeah, was there an audience question? Or let me see here. There is one. Oops, what happened? Oh,
Oh, no.
somehow, yeah, no. I must have muted the owl.
Oh.
That's what happened. Sorry about that.
Well, and again, thanks everybody that tuned in from home.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's-
As they live so long, what kind of weight category do they get into?
They often still don't even really get to be that big. I read what was the heaviest fish. I still think the heaviest sucker was still only around like 12 pounds or something. But that's a hefty sucker. Yeah, but they're otherwise like we're only talking a few pounds. Yes, David. Oh, I'm
We
sorry,
heard
David.
stories of other migrating fish in the past, like the smelts, that they would be just scooping them out by the truckful. Is there anything that this can contribute to understanding what happened to those species?
mean, I think that it's maybe more of that, of the fact that when you think something's so common, we maybe forget, like, it's not an endless supply, right? You know, there's a tipping point for reproducing and bringing populations back. I guess that's my biggest connection to, you know, that kind of a story of where something seems so in abundance and then it's gone.
Well,
Oh, yeah,
I can add more to that.
great.
So smelt is a non-native fish. And when they move out into the lake, they're more pelagic. So they're up in the water column, where I think suckers stay down near the bottom. So it's been fairly well documented that the decline of smelt has been associated with the increase in salmon. So it's the predation by the trout and salmon that actually is holding the smelt numbers low, especially when alewife numbers have dropped, and you know, anything that's out there for them to eat, they will. But I think that's the difference between the two. We don't really know much about what happens out in the lake. I mean,
No,
we know more in the rivers, but out in the, like out in Lake Michigan, we're not sure where they go. That's for sure. Do you ever see hognose in Door County tributaries?
I haven't seen any. I've seen them in tributaries around Illinois.
Right. So I was just wondering what,
Yeah,
yeah.
I haven't. Jane had a question and then I see a hand
Well, that
on.
relates to my question. Are the sucker species around the world? Are they strictly North American, or are they all over North America? And what's their range for suckers?
There's quite a number of different species in North America that range, and so we won't get some of the suckers like blue suckers that you'd find in like New Mexico and other areas. But as far as their diversity around the world, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but through North America, there's a number of species. And so like in terms of where white suckers and long-nosed suckers go, they have a pretty big range. I'm less familiar with like hog sucker range and some of the other species too. But there's definitely some of the species that are much more like southern and that we don't see up here and not into Canada at all. Is this
So Brett on Zoom, do you have a question? Actually, anybody that's on Zoom, if you want to, okay, Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the great presentation. I just want to say hello. We're doing some really similar work down in Georgia with Brian. He's on the call as well. We've got a migratory red horse sucker, and we're pit tagging them, and we're using an antenna. And I saw your system, and I was just if I could just ask a couple quick method questions. Are those suckers having to swim through like a loop? Is that how you do that? Or is it like
No.
a passover antenna where it's a buried wire in the stream?
Yeah, it's just sitting above the substrate and it's only out prior to when the suckers are gonna show up, and as soon as the spawning is over, it's removed. But the water depth in that creek is not, isn't consistently deep enough to have a system where they would swim through. The fish tend to actually, in a spot where they go further upstream, there's a spot where they love to just hang out, and they often just sit around that antenna. But we're finding pretty good detection range. I do have a submersible antenna as well, which if you want to like email me, we can talk a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty great system, but it's interesting. The submersible antenna has really good detection range. And what's neat about that, my other antennas have to run off of power, or else I'd be switching out the units repeatedly, or like have to set up a solar unit. So in the particular system that I'm working in, I have access to run my antennas off of power from 2 residents. But the submersible antenna, the battery life for that is about 4 weeks, which is pretty good. And then you can just swap out with another battery. But they're a pretty sweet system too. And the detection range is pretty good.
Awesome. Are you, how are you catching the suckers, to pit tag them? We're using a fike net and that's working pretty well. Although, you know, when you get a big flood, it can be problematic and you got to check it all the time. But I was just curious how you're catching them and where you're pit tagging them.
Yeah, the creek that we've been working in for the pit tagging is pretty narrow and only like 650 meters long before you hit an impassable barrier. So it's quite easy to just dip net. We don't, you don't even have to electrofish or set any other nets in there. And because there's some culverts, it works pretty easily to have somebody upstream and then the fish just come right down and you can just scoop them up in the dip net. And then as far as the placement of the pit tag, we're just placing it in the belly and just injecting with a 23 millimeter pit tag. So it's just a quick injection into the body cavity.
That's awesome. We're doing it in the back and it's great. They keep the tag there forever. It doesn't seem to hurt them, but what happens is our antenna is on the bottom of the stream and we're missing some fish because if they're not right on the bottom, they don't get detected. And if I had only done what you did, Karen, and tagged them in the belly, we wouldn't have that problem. So I was just, yeah.
And I mean, so, you know, here we are in 2022 and we'll see what return rates are, but I mean, clearly we've had really good returns over the years. So it's working well. I suspect, you know, we still could miss a few fish even with the 3 antenna system. But I feel pretty comfortable that we're picking up all the fish that come back.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think too, I don't know whether that slide's not up, but I'll just drop my email in the chat again. It's Murchie@sheddaquarium.org if you want to, there you go. If you want to send me a message and we can chat some more about it.
Cool. Thank you.
I think there was another. Thank you for tuning in. I mean, I'm super curious of the work that you guys will be doing on the red horse.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's another question. This one came in the chat. Do we know much about how suckers accumulate contamination in comparison to other species? Since they are a bit lower on the food chain, are they safer fish to eat? Thanks. So I don't know super well about the contaminant levels for these species, but I do know that they have been used before to look at, you know, how much fish are hanging around effluent from like different mills and so on. They can tend to accumulate tumors and other things. So they're definitely not immune from picking up contaminants in the water column. But as far as guidelines for consumption goes, I mean, I think we're also learning so much more about other chemicals that exist in the waterways that we weren't even monitoring much before, like the PFAS. So compared to things like mercury contamination, I don't have a good answer for you on that question.
So if anybody else on the Zoom wants to turn their mic off and actually ask a question, please feel free to do so.
Karen, I have a question. You said you were looking at putting some acoustic tags in suckers this year. How many do you plan on tagging? And do you plan on tagging them all in one creek or separate creeks?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're gonna tag 60 suckers. The tags are just shy of 300 a piece. So this is a really great opportunity to split the 60 fish between 30 males, 30 females. Gonna stick with tagging them all from one system because also, you know, I think Coggin can describe too, in Big Creek, we'll get a lot of people that come to the creek and will catch the suckers and handle them. That's not something I necessarily want to have the additional stress on the fish that we're tagging. So they're all going to be in one creek that doesn't seem to get much pressure. So, and also a system too, where we've had a good understanding of seeing repeat fish come back year after year, so. And then the hope is to build on the success of year one and add more individuals tagged. So tag more white suckers, but then also hopefully expand to tag long nose suckers and do similar work with the pit tag telemetry on these species because some of their populations are starting to go down as well. In Illinois, they're a state threatened fish. So it would be nice to learn more about their biology as well. You guys have really good questions.
As Dr. Kruger explained when he was talking about the acoustic program, you know, they've gone more from, they're going to switch to a grid system for these receivers out in Green Bay and even part of Sturgeon Bay, instead of just like a fence where they'd swim through. So if they go in Green Bay, there's a good chance we could track them all the way up to Washington Island, right?
Yeah, and what's really interesting too, even just this grid array that Dr. Chuck Kruger had talked about in his talk in January, but if you weren't here for that, basically imagine this is a listening station. It's pretty close to the same width, a little bit shorter. The water bottle is than the receiver. But if you've got a tagged fish and it swims within a kilometer, it's a line of sight technology. So in a deeper water from that range, this receiver will go, oh, that's fish 123 at this date and time. And that stores that information in the receiver. And then the collaborators, you know, it doesn't matter who owns this listening station, anybody's fish, whether it's a bass, a sturgeon, a walleye, a sucker, that information goes into a database and we make sure that information is shared back to the researchers so they know, oh, my fish was in Sturgeon Bay and then it was in Southern Green Bay. And that's a pretty cool aspect in the Great Lakes that I think is worth recognizing, the information sharing and collaboration that goes on to understand the fishery. So that's pretty cool. And these grid systems are still designed more for migratory pelagic fish, things like walleye and whitefish that are swimming higher in the water column. It'll be curious to see how well the grid system works for suckers too. But this is a good starting place. There is some work that's already happening with both white sucker and longnose sucker on the eastern side of Lake Michigan, closer to the Boardman River. And they've been tagging suckers for a little bit now. So we'll be able to compare results too. So,
If you want to know more about the acoustic thing and missed it, go to the Door County Library on January 31st and you can watch that program.
yeah.
I got a question. So how many suckers are we talking about? In Big Creek or Hines Creek? Are we talking about 300? Are we talking about 3,000?
No, so it really depends. So in the smaller tributary where we've been tagging the fish, we would walk the entire length every other day and with a clicker count the fish. And that small tributary that only goes 650 meters before an impassable barrier had over 1,000 individuals there. Then if you've got a tributary like Hines Creek, we're talking thousands of suckers. And that's even still a little harder to enumerate because I can honestly say I've never walked from the mouth all the way up to the barrier right before Kangaroo Lake. But you can see in one spot like hundreds of fish. Then imagine where they're staged throughout the whole tributary. In the Kewanee River, we're talking tens of thousands of suckers that they get in there. So it really ranges. Tributary size definitely makes a difference for how many suckers. And then there's like a tiny little creeks too, like even at the Ridges Sanctuary, there's a small brook that occasionally gets suckers when the water level is high enough. And, you know, maybe they don't even get 100 fish that show up in there or some other very small ones. So it definitely ranges.
Any more questions from those people on Zoom? Just unmute your microphone and ask it.
I think people are ready for some St. Patty's Day beer.
Yeah.
Are there any other fish that eat suckers besides the northern pike?
Yep, the bass, will eat them, walleye will eat them, muskie, probably just a number of, fish that are, meat eaters or carnivores and eat other fish. So if they can fit their mouth around a sucker, they'll eat them. And I'll also say there's a number of birds that will eat them. They're food often for eagles and ospreys, loons and herons will eat some of the juvenile suckers, and then of course too, bears will happily feast on a
They're
on
nice
a
and
sucker.
soft.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
when you go to the bait store, the largest fish usually in the middle tanks is a sucker.
Yeah.
There
So,
was some neat footage of wolves feeding on suckers up in Minnesota.
oh, there you go. Yeah. I had thought of something. Oh, yeah, I was just also gonna say, even in terms of that, I talked about the nutrients getting taken up by the little invertebrates in the creek. But if those caddisfly larvae evade being eaten by a trout or another fish in the creek, they hatch and fly around and become food for birds and bats. So again, we still get to thank suckers. If you love birds, you should love suckers. If you love fish, you should love suckers. They're important for all sorts of animals. So I forgot that plug earlier. I know this is a good birding community as well. So it's just a buffet of food thanks to suckers. So yes.
Are you looking for other volunteers for other streams that are not mine? Because I talk to a lot of fishermen when I do mine, I said, you ought to try this stream, or, do you have volunteers for more, or I said, well, you could do this, it doesn't take much time.
Yeah, so right now, even just to add other streams at this point, this is something I probably should have put in my presentation. We've got the Great Lakes Fish Finder app, which is a project that is nested under iNaturalist. So if you're not familiar with the app iNaturalist, it's something that if you observe trees or bugs or birds, you can take a picture, log your sighting. If you don't know what it is that you're looking at, it's like a crowdsourced identification for like, help me ID this bird. Somebody will say, oh, that's, a red-winged blackbird. And then it logs that date and time and the location where you've seen that animal. We developed the Great Lakes Fish Finder app at Shedd to encourage more people to know their fish observations. Because iNaturalist is something that's used worldwide. And if you look at all the different organisms that are logged, there's lots and lots of birds, there's quite a number of insects, there's lots of trees, but fish is just this tiny little section on the pie chart. And we thought, well, in the Great Lakes, it'd be great to encourage more people to log fish. So that's something, Steve, that I think, I could do a better job as well of just highlighting for people that are out. If you're looking for steelhead and you observe a sucker, that's information that, the more information that's logged, there's more that we can do with it. And I'm definitely trying to branch out into, more of these tagging studies and have consistent data for locations year after year after year, and not just like, add this creek and only get 1 year's worth of data. So I'd like to be able to grow the program more, but I think right now using the Great Lakes Fish Finder app for people to log those observations is a good start of seeing where else there might be an appetite for more creeks. Yeah.
So that's a separate app from iNaturalist?
You can use just iNaturalist and log that information and we'll still get it. With the Great Lakes Fish Finder app, if you've already got iNaturalist on your phone, they don't work well together because it's already got the iNaturalist platform. But what we had done with the Great Lakes Fish Finder app too was put a little species ID guide of some of the most common Great Lakes fishes. So if you were only interested in fishes and you use that, it's got that nifty extra function. But yeah, and we have been able to use that information to look at people taking pictures of small-bodied fishes like dace and so on. And through just the pictures that people take, look at, oh, this one's got black spot disease. We don't know so much about that. Where are we seeing pictures of these fish that have that disease that they're exhibiting? And that's not something necessarily that an agency would put a lot of money towards. But if you've got a lot of people out and they're fishing and they're uploading pictures, it's a great opportunity to get more crowdsourced information. And there's way more anglers than scientists. So even in terms of documenting, occurrences of invasive species, or even seeing shifts in the distribution range of some of the different fishes, moving further north as water temperatures warm up. That's something else too that I think, an app-based program that anglers contribute to. There's a lot of good potential there. Oh, you're a really good audience. So many good questions.
Well, but the sign of a great presenter is more than 30 minutes of
Yeah,
questions.
there we go.
So thank you all for showing up, either on Zoom or in person. It's been another great season. Hopefully we'll do this again next year. And if you want to make comments, it's fishtailslecture@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you as to what you think. And but most importantly, let's give her a great big